Alright, so I'm going to do a basic tutorial on communication between your Atlas application and your server. Hopefully you've done the more basic tutorials on creating outlets and connecting them to objects in your interface. So I've created this basic interface which has two text fields connected to outlets in my app controller. One is called input and the other is the output, and then there's this button, and the button has a method in the app controller called button pressed that it's connected to. Alright, so here's the method that gets called when the button is pressed. So this is where I'm going to have the communication with the server happen. To communicate with the server, what you need is an object called the CPURL request. And so if you look in the Cappuccino documentation for CPURL request, here's the initialization function in it with URL. And so I'll just create a request object here. Okay, and here you would have the URL of your server-side script. So, www.whatever./.something.php. In my case, I've defined a base URL variable previously and imported it up here. So, I mean, you could define the base URL or do it any other way. I just did this for privacy reasons, basically. So base URL plus, let's call something test.php. Alright. And then I'll add some parameters here. Input equals. And I'm going to send my PHP function the value of that input text field. Let's say input object value. Alright, so this entire thing here is the URL, including the parameters that are being passed to the PHP function. Okay, so this is your request object, and actually, if you wanted to use post or some other method instead of get, you could do that as well. Like what you do is after initializing your request object with some base URL without parameters, then you would say like test request set method or something. You can look in the documentation to see those methods, like set HTTP method. You would say post or request or whatever, and then you can set the HTTP body. You can set values for HTTP header fields. So all that is more complex stuff that I'm not going to do in this tutorial, but it's available to you. So anyway, to send this request to the server, we create a CPURL connection object. And so again, we can look that up in the documentation here and see how to initialize it. So CPURL connection, and I'm going to use this initialization method in it with request and set delegate. So let's say test connection. So the request that I'm going to initialize it with, obviously, is going to be the test request that I just created. And then the delegate I'm going to set to self. Alright, so a little bit about what the delegate is for. As it is, if I run this program, it will run, assuming I haven't done anything stupid. And when I press communicate, it's actually accessing this URL, whatever I have here. But not having two-way communication, that's not very useful. I can't see that anything's happening. Um, and so we want some way to get the reply, whatever the server replies, back into my application program. And that's what the delegate is used for. Um, so if we look in the documentation for CPU-URL connection, look in the code itself, in the header here, you have defined your delegate methods. And so, for example, if your communication failed with an error, this method here would get called in whatever object you set as the delegate over here. So in this case, I set this app controller itself to be the delegate. So if I created a method over here that matched this method, then that method would get called if it failed with an error. If I receive a response, you can get this this method to be called. Did receive data, we'll get this method called. Did finish loading, if you're not getting any response, but you just want to make sure the connection got completely loaded, then you would have this method in whatever you set as a delegate. So I'm going to use did receive data here. So I just defined the delegate method here. Alright, so now when I receive a response with some data from this script that I've defined here, this method's going to be called. So in this method, all I'll do is I'll set output object value. So I'm going to set the value of that output text field to be whatever the PHP script returns. Right, so I'll just save everything and build and run. Okay, and just a little bit, this test.php, I've created it previously, and all it does is, well, you'll see what it does. All it does is take whatever you have as an input, and then it says, it adds a string to the beginning, say the number was, and then just echoes it. So it just has echo and then output that you see here. So when I push communicate, we get here, the number is 1. And if I put 5, then I get the number is 5. Right? So, in general, though, you're going to have more than one CPU-URL connection in your application because you're communicating with your server about many different things, and so in order to distinguish between them in this method, what you're going to have to do is say if a connection equals test connection, and then do this, and if it equals some other connection, then do something else, and so on. Alright, so that's how you would have more than one communication going on with your server at the same time. And in this case, this can't be a local variable anymore, so you have to add it up here as a CPU-URL connection instance variable for the whole object. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Simple two-way communication. For more other things you can do, just look at the documentation for CPU-URL request. Look at the headers you can set, the different methods you can set for your communication and so on, and then you can look in CPU-URL connection documentation for those delegate methods and other things you can receive back from your function. Like for in general, you always want to have a one of those delegate methods that catches errors, so you can output it or debug it or whatever. So you would have a connection, and I think it's did fail with error ID and error, and then you can do whatever you want in here.